Welcome, everyone, to the ICSS Sunday Morning Marxist Forum. My name is Alan Miller, and I'm a member of the program committee for ICSS Sunday Morning Sessions. We are based in Oakland, California, in the San Francisco Bay Area. Our weekly programs are online via Zoom every Sunday morning at 10:30 a.m. Pacific Time, and you can sign up at our website, icssmarks.org, to receive weekly email announcements for future sessions and to view videos of our past sessions. Today's session is on Syria, which has been in the news. Our speaker today is Rick Sterling, who will provide an update and analysis of recent events in Syria. Rick is an investigative journalist based in the San Francisco Bay Area. He has written many articles about Syria and has traveled there 5 times and has contacts on the ground. We're going to start with a presentation by Rick, followed by a short break for announcements, and then questions and comments from participants. So welcome everyone to Sunday Morning Marxist Forum. And Rick, welcome to you, and please proceed. I think you're muted.
Okay, so I didn't mute myself, but you did, but I was able to unmute myself. So very nice to be here. Thanks, Alan, and the rest of the team. You guys have been doing very good work for a very long time, so kudos for that. And it's nice to be here today, although the subject is not very nice, honestly. I think I was thinking about what might be interesting to discuss today, and I've got a few topics that I plan to briefly cover. First is what is happening now. I'm going to talk about why did the Syrian forces collapse? Why did the West try so hard for so long at regime change in Syria? Why did Israel try so hard for so long? The war beginning in 2011, Western propaganda today, and the consequences of where we are right now and the prospects for the future. So first of all, what's happening now? In Syria, we have the new Islamic State of Syria being formed. They have effective control of almost the entire country. There are some regions in the east that are questionable, but otherwise they've got control of the major cities: Damascus, Homs, Hama, Latakia, and they are implementing their power, including in Aleppo. Our contacts in Aleppo and Latakia indicate that things are not chaotic there, that there are examples of assassinations going on. There are examples of the emergence of extremism. There's some videos online. If you look at rt.com, a recent report there has a 9-minute video collection of some of the examples of assassinations and atrocities that are being committed. But our contacts indicate that the people we know on the ground in Aleppo and Latakia indicate that those cities are more or less proceeding normally with the HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, rebranded Al-Qaeda, taking power. There are some assassinations happening. We don't know whether that's going to spread much more. There are some people who believe that that's going to extend a lot more, that lists are being compiled of people who worked for what they call the regime, that is the government. And at the same time, there's some measure of conflict going on in the east, especially between the Kurds and Turkey. Turkey, of course, is in some ways, it's primarily interested in repressing, suppressing, defeating the Kurds in Syria to prevent there being a Kurdish state and prevent there being Syrian Kurdish active solidarity with the Kurdish community in Turkey. Meanwhile, right now, in the last week, and it's only 1 week since Damascus fell, it's kind of amazing that it was just last Sunday that Bashar al-Assad fled Damascus, flew to Latakia, and then on to Moscow. And so it's been an extremely rapid transfer of power from, which is the conclusion of a war that's been going on since the active war has been going on since 2011. In some respects, the war has been going on for probably 30 years at least. But the active war has been going on since March of 2011, and it all came to a terminus, and who knows what's going to happen in the future. Obviously, nobody knows for sure, but right now we've seen incredibly dramatic changes that few people predicted just in the last 2 weeks, beginning with the assault on Aleppo. Right now, in the last days, this past week after the collapse of the Damascus government and the departure of Assad, Israel has invaded the demilitarized zone. They've taken all of Mount Hermon. They are encroaching on Syrian territory and threatening to go beyond that. In addition, they've waged their biggest ever bombing campaign. That's the biggest in the entire history of Israel. They've never done the intensity of attacks that they've carried out against Syrian industrial sites, military warehouses, military bases, military air bases, military manufacturing sites. It's been hundreds of intense bombing attacks. The entire Syrian Navy was destroyed in the port of Latakia. So throughout the country, and this has been accompanied, of course, we have the departure of Assad. We have the new power of Mohammed al-Jolani coming in. He's got another name now, but we'll call him Jolani. Jolani and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and their new prime minister has said virtually nothing about the attacks by Israel, except they've said, well, they've got other things to worry about. So that's a pretty astounding admission, which points to the fact of ultimately, who are their patrons. The next thing I want to talk about is, why did the Syrian forces collapse so rapidly? And there's conflicting information, and there's kind of regarding the negotiations, regarding what Assad did or didn't do. There are some people say that he had prepared a statement that was not broadcast. There are other people say that's not true. And over time, I expect we will learn more about what exactly happened and why he didn't speak out, and why the Syrian military did not protect the city more, beginning with Aleppo. But I think in terms of the collapse, there are two elements to it. One is the attacking forces. And it was not Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is really there was a coalition of forces that carried out the assault. There was Hayat Tahrir al-Sham HTS. There was the Turkish forces, Syrian forces called the Syrian National Army. And you had all sorts of other groups, including thousands and thousands of foreign fighters who have been involved in the conflict from the beginning. But one report was there were 20,000 fighters and 5,000 of them were Uyghurs from Eastern China or from far Western China. Um, they were very carefully prepared. They used the lull that in some ways we've had a frozen conflict for the last several years where in Idlib province, which is on the border with Turkey, that is the far north of Syria to the west, the northwest, and bordering Turkey. And that is there's a city Idlib and there's a province Idlib. They've had effective control of Idlib, and there was an agreement that was come to in between negotiations, the Astana agreement between Iran, Russia, and Turkey, whereby they vacated, the Syrian army defeated them in Aleppo in 2016, and they were allowed to leave. In fact, they left on hundreds and hundreds of buses. Syrian buses transported them from Aleppo to Idlib, and then others gathered in the Idlib as they were beaten back by the Syrian Arab Army. Anyway, you had the jihadist forces that have had effective control of a province in Syria, and they've been allowed to not only receive a lot of humanitarian aid, so that they have things there have been relatively thriving compared to the rest of Syria. A lot of the humanitarian aid that was collected in the West, supposedly for Syria, that was going to Idlib province and to the region that was governed by the jihadists, by the offshoot of Al Qaeda, HTS. And not only have they received all this humanitarian aid, they've received a lot of training, military training, military equipment. We don't know the details, but clearly this was coming from governments. It was coming from Turkey, and I think it was coming from the West and basically NATO. In addition, you had Ukrainians who have been trained to be adept at managing drones, and you had Ukrainians train jihadists from Syria in the use of drones, both for observation and for attack purposes. I think it's very likely that there was direct NATO participation in the training, both from the US, the UK, and some of the other powers that have been involved in the Syrian conflict. So while the Syrian army was slowly decaying, and I'll get into that in a minute, the jihadist forces were being built up and re-equipped, and they were being sharpened. They were being not only trained in military matters and equipment and modern fighting through drones and other means. They of course had tanks, and they had electronic warfare equipment. They were able to jam the Syrian communications so that the Syrian army was operating blind. Their electronic communication was taken out of commission. The jihadists had political training because the West, which has sponsored the jihadists from the start, clearly did not want a repeat of Libya, where there was total chaos following the collapse of the government, the overthrow of the Gaddafi government. So you had the jihadists being trained. They also had a lot of money. And one of our contacts reported that They were so effective that they had individuals contacting individuals in Aleppo. These were influential individuals, either in professional or in government or in military, offering them monetary bribes of hundreds of dollars. This is at a time where the salary for a soldier in Syria was under $10 a month. And for a general, I've heard that it was $40 a month. But obviously that's a minimal amount of minimal amount of money. In contrast, the jihadists fighting for HTS and the coalition of groups, I've heard reports that they were being paid $2,000 a month. So there's a mercenary aspect to it all. Uh, I think in terms of why the Syrian forces collapsed, so you've got the two elements. You've got the effective training and the weaponization of the invading force, the HTS and their allies, and you had the slow collapse and degrading of the Syrian forces. They've been fighting for, and now it's 14 years. And at the same time, their country has been strangled economically. Syria's been under sanctions for decades, but the sanctions really escalated to the point, I'm not sure there's any, I think Syria may be the most heavily sanctioned country in the world by the U.S. The U.S. was doing everything in its power to strangle the economy, the Syrian central bank, through third-party sanctions from the U.S. Any government or company that had dealings with the Syrian central bank could be sanctioned by the U.S. Obviously, that scared countries and companies away from dealing with them. They were unable to rebuild. There were specific sanctions preventing the shipment of building material to Syria. So it was a combination of the economic sanctions coupled with the occupation of a very important part of Syria, which is in the east, which is the primary oil producing area of Syria. Previously, Syria was self-sufficient in oil, and it was also it had a huge wheat growing area, and that is also part of the occupied zone. Who's it occupied? It's occupied. The enforcement is by the United States, and it's with in alliance with the Kurdish, with some of the Kurds who formed under the U.S. tutelage, the so-called Syrian Democratic Forces. They were given that name, of course, in consultation with the U.S. military. So they have controlled the east of Syria for 5, 6 years now. And that's been part of the strangulation of the economy, because now Syria, for several years, the reports are that you only have electricity for a couple of hours a day. When I was last there, somebody was saying to me, how do you think we feel? There's no internet, there's no power, you can't run a refrigerator, your food goes bad, and life is miserable. So these were the circumstances, and there was a slow deterioration in the morale of the public after all those years of warfare, and they thought they had won, because in the Battle of Aleppo in 2017, the Syrian army was victorious, but it went into this rather than allowing the Syrian army to imprison or to kill the jihadists who were occupying East Aleppo. they came up with this agreement which allowed the frozen conflict. They allowed the jihadists to go to Idlib province, where they had other people and they had attacked from, but so it was there was a process of strengthening of the jihadist forces and a slow weakening of the Syrian Arab army. And I think throughout society there was a level of wherever you have sanctions and a lot of restrictions, you're going to have black markets and an increase in corruption. So things can't be done openly, so they're done privately, and that leads to the expansion of kickbacks, of third-party deals, and ultimately of corruption. And I think it expanded and to the point that a lot of the government officials were on the take for one reason or another. Everybody's looking out there for their own family, and when you can't feed your own family, people do desperate things, and so that definitely played a role in the collapse of the Syrian government. So the next question is, why did the West try so hard for regime change? Why did Syria matter to the United States and to the West? And I think there are several factors here. One is that Syria has been an ally for a long time. It was an ally of the Soviet Union, and then Russia. It was a semi-socialist state. They had free healthcare, they had free education, they had a lot of government factories. They had a pretty good economy. I had Syrians tell me that this was the best country in the world, and I know numerous Westerners, including myself, who were just amazed and in love with Damascus. It was an incredible city with incredibly friendly people. The history and the authenticity of the city compared to some other cities which have been quote unquote modernized or westernized. In contrast to that, Damascus and Aleppo are amazing, and um, uh, you had in terms of why the West tried so hard for regime change, you had it being semi-socialist, it being economically independent. They had very little or no foreign debt. They had restrictions that very much limited the amount of control that could take place over their economy by the West. So those were some of the things that the West didn't like about Syria, that wasn't under their control. And also because Syria has been an Arab nationalist state, that it worked for Arab unity, and that it was a strong supporter of the Palestinian cause. Um, they oppose, and Syria additionally was a secular state. All religions were welcome and were treated with respect. People didn't ask what religion a person belonged to, whether it was Sunni or Shia or Alawi or Christian or even Jewish. There were all elements to the society, and it was considered extremely rude to ask about a person's religion. So there had been conflict, especially under Hafez al-Assad, between the government and the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a sectarian organization, sectarian Sunni organization that historically has been promoted by the UK and US especially, because it can be effective for dividing. Divide and conquer is the keystone of the British rule and occupation, and they have used that to great effect. So in contrast with the sectarianism and sectarian religious beliefs, in Syria, it was very strongly secular and accepting of all religions and faiths. The support for the Palestinian cause was really crucial in some respects. In about in the late in about 2018 or 2019, Nancy Pelosi was uh, 2008 or 9, I mean, 2 or 3 years before the insurrection began in 2011. Nancy Pelosi went to Damascus and met with Assad and had a very nice meeting until she more or less insisted that Syria come to a peace treaty with Israel, because it was still at war with Israel technically, because of out of Israel's occupation of Golan and Israel's repression and occupation of Palestine. So Assad said, "Thank you very much, but no, we're not going to. It's up to Israel to make peace with the Palestinians, to accept a Palestinian state, or to do away with apartheid in Israel." So that was a big contributing factor to the West's hostility that kind of pushed it over the line. Prior to that, and not only Nancy Pelosi went to Damascus and met with Assad, but Asma Assad, the first president's wife, had a very favorable newspaper feature article in I think it was Vanity Fair. They called her the Desert Rose, and so there was an attempt to woo Assad and to change the policies of Syria to be more to be less resistant to Israel and the U.S. But when Assad said no, when he stuck to the principles, then he got moved up on the hit list priority. The next question is that I've got is why did Israel try so hard for so long to overthrow Syria? And some good commentators like Jeffrey Sachs, I was listening to a few days ago. Of course, he's very good on Ukraine as well and what's going on there. But he's spoken out very well about Syria and the causes. And he mentions the clean break analysis from 1995, which was produced for the Likud, for Ariel Sharon and Benjamin Netanyahu and others like that, which was a negation of the Oslo Agreement. In other words, the clean break document was proposing the theory that they need to make a clean break from that, the understanding that led to the understanding and agreements, signed agreements from Israel that were part of the Oslo Accords, and they need to concentrate on crushing the Palestinians. And a key part of crushing the Palestinians, as well as Lebanese resistance, was crushing any state sponsor of them, any states that were sympathetic or supportive of the Palestinians, needed to be confronted and needed to be crushed. At the same time, and very much in keeping with that philosophy, Benjamin Netanyahu wrote a book called Fighting Terrorism: How Democracies Can Defeat the International Terrorist Network. And the thrust of this book is to say that the Palestinian cause is basically terrorism. And terrorism is the biggest threat in the world today, not for Israel, but for the West and for the U.S. particularly. And that terrorism cannot exist without state support, and therefore Therefore, he argued we need to do everything we can to defeat those states that sponsor terrorism. And just a few quotes from the book. I think I'll probably do a review of the book here in the next week or so, because I've been reading it. I've had it on the shelf for many years, but I've been looking at it more closely and reading it. It's not a long book, but it is very interesting and it's very clear. I'll give Benjamin Netanyahu that. I don't want to give it a kudo for sure, but I'll give Netanyahu that acknowledgement. He's very straightforward. He says that, and this is ironic. So his book is called Fighting Terrorism, and you need to define terrorism. And Benjamin Netanyahu says that terrorism is deliberate killing of civilians. So I wonder what the people of Gaza would have to say about that. Um, Obviously, Israel today is killing civilians, tens of thousands of civilians, probably well over 100,000 civilians. I think it was 4 months ago, the Lancet article estimated there'd be 186,000 dead as a result of Israeli massacres in Gaza, Israeli genocide in Gaza. And if that 186,000 number from 4 months ago is correct, then probably 90% of that or 95% of that are civilians. So Benjamin Netanyahu saying that terrorism is deliberate killing of civilians. By that definition, obviously, Israel is a terrorist state. But that's not his perspective, obviously. And Netanyahu does say what is at stake is the survival of civilization. So he equates Israel with the US, with civilization. And he goes on, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East and the purest manifestation of Western progress and freedom, an island of Western democratic values. And he says, crucially, we must cut off the state's support of terrorism, and the key enemies are Libya, Syria, and Iran. So that's very clear, and the racism of it is also very clear, and that's what led to the escalation of the attacks on Syria. It's been under pressure for a long time. There have been spies in Syria. There's been sabotage in Syria for a long time. And just as a side note, I was reflecting on the fact that Syria, some people refer to it as an authoritarian state, as a police state. I've visited there, as Ellen was saying, 5 times, and it's quite it's amazing to walk around at any time of day or night. The people are very friendly. There's very little presence of military. When I went, and I went for the first time in 2014, and the last time just 2 years ago. There's very little presence of military or police. But in any case, but it was always very hard to get into Syria at the border. Even on delegations that had been planned in advance, it was very hard, and it's very hard to get a visa to enter Syria. And why is that? Well, part of the reason is because they know they have been attacked. They know that there are people working to go into Syria and find spies to give them information. They know there are people who are outsiders, outside governments that want to sabotage Syria. So when you know that there are enemies actively working to undermine you, obviously the defenses go up, and sometimes and that's one contributor. to things being very tightly controlled. But in any case, after Nancy Pelosi's visit and the efforts, and um, it wasn't long after that that the overthrow of the government in Libya in Tripoli happened, and subsequent to that, there was the emergence of armed insurrection in Syria, both coming from the north and coming from the south. Uh, we subsequently learned from documents released by, or documents from the Defense Intelligence Agency of the U.S. that that weapons and the stockpile of weapons from the Libyan government, some of those were shipped to Syria for use by the jihadists. They were shipped via Turkey, and there were other weapons that came into the country from the south, from Jordan. Um, and there were lots of foreign fighters in this. And people had been recruited on the basis of radical Islam. Many people say that that's not Islam, and that's my belief, that the sectarian form of Islamism is not the core or the truth of the religion. It's an aberration, the so-called Wahhabi offshoot of Islam. But in any case, there were many people recruited: Chechens, Uyghurs, Canadians. Yes, Canadians. There were 4 young men from Calgary, Alberta, who were recruited. They were true blood Canadians, or they were white Canadians from Calgary who had taken a belief in Islam and attended a mosque in one part of Calgary, and they were recruited, and 3 of the 4 died in Syria. But there were many others, and many other non-Canadians, obviously, many Chechens, many Uyghurs, Uzbeks, who were recruited in similar fashion, most of whom went to Syria via Turkey. Um, and when the conflict broke out, it wasn't long before it became clear that a lot of the fighters were totally ruthless. And I think in the past I've shown videos of the truck bombing of Kindi Hospital, the most modern, the biggest and best hospital in Syria, the Kindi Hospital. And a huge truck carried with a suicide bomber, went into that hospital and destroyed the building. And then following that, the Syrian soldiers who had been trying to defend it, they were assassinated. And this was video that was filmed by the jihadists, but that was very strong evidence of the ruthlessness of the fighters who were trying to. Some of them weren't even Syrian. The Gulf monarchies were supplying a lot of money. Turkey was involved. Israel was involved right at that stage. The U.S. was involved. At one point, the CIA budget was $1 billion a year, and there were some complaints. This is too much. This is over the top. But think of that. $1 billion to interfere in another country that has done nothing to you. So the West was providing weapons. They were providing training. They were recruiting people, and it was kind of an evil coalition of countries. You had you had Qatar, you had Saudi Arabia involved at the time, you had Turkey, and the West, and in addition to Syria. There's a young Lebanese journalist named Serena Shim. She documented in 2012, she documented how there were training camps for the Syrian fighters set up just over the border in Turkey. So she actually filmed that provide evidence that these were fighters being trained with trained with the Turkish knowledge. At the same time, and the next little topic that I'm going to go into here is the Western propaganda. And we really saw the modern form of propaganda in the Syrian war. They really honed some of their skills in propaganda in the war. The sarin gas attack in August 2013, which the neocons in the U.S. and many of the antagonists wanted, whereby they wanted the U.S. to directly intervene in the conflict, since it wasn't going all that well for the fighters on the ground. But the impetus for that was going to be a gas attack where there was a claim that the Syrian government had used sarin gas, had crossed the quote unquote the red line that President Obama had set up or had stated 4 or 5 months before. He said that if the Damascus regime used chemical weapons, that would be a red line, and the U.S. would have to get involved. So that was an invitation to the jihadists to start planning for a chemical weapon attack and blame it on the Syrian government, which is precisely what they did. At the time, there were many people that said there were a lot of fishy things about this that didn't make any sense. A lot of people said it was a false flag, but of course they were shouted down by people said no. Well, of course the government did it. It was about a year later that Seymour Hersh revealed that with his article, The Red Line and the Rat Line, how it had been Turkish intelligence with one of the jihadi groups which had staged this with the goal of involving the U.S. There were many claims of chemical weapons used by the government. All of them, when you superficially, they looked convincing, but the more you looked into them, the more unconvincing they looked. There was attacks where, when you looked at the timings, it didn't make sense because there were reports that there were weapons attacks, and the reports were coming from villages, and they were before the events had actually happened. So you had reports of an incident happening, but the incident, happened at a later time. That was exposed by Robert Perry. In 2018, you had a gas attack claiming chlorine was used in Duma, and then subsequently you had the weapons inspectors from the Organization for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons, OPCW. You had the official European inspectors saying that the report had been falsified, that there was not evidence of that, and this kind of thing. And overall, you had a demonization. It was pretty simple: demonize Assad and hide the public Syrian support for Assad, and whitewash and glorify the opposition. It wasn't Al-Qaeda, it was moderate rebels. In conjunction with the whitewashing of the opposition, you had the creation of the White Helmets, which was presented as a Syrian grassroots effort that was intent on saving people who were in buildings that had been attacked. And investigations showed that the White Helmets was a creation of a British military officer, come MI6 agent, and was totally funded from the West. So and then of course that was backed up by Hollywood, which made a nice movie, which won an Academy Award and all that sort of thing. So that was just those were examples of the of the Western propaganda. Western propaganda today, we can see this has just moved on to a new stage. We've got the head of HTS, Al-Jilani, who was formerly ISIS, not just Al-Qaeda. He was formerly ISIS and worked with Baghdadi and has been associated with some of the worst crimes of ISIS. You have here, you have the leader of the group, the force behind the throne in Syria today is an official terrorist, but he has been scrubbed clean. He's been scrubbed literally in terms of he's had his beard shaved and he's been given a Zelensky style shirt, open neck shirt to look a little better. And he's cleaned up his rhetoric as well. And just to make sure it's super clean, they will provide the translator to say what he's saying in Arabic to translate it into English. So he's been cleaned up. That began several years ago with Charles Lister, an analyst closely associated with the neocon think tanks in the U.S. But in addition to that, you've got the exaggeration of support for the new government. I certainly don't deny that there is some support, and I think a lot of people, such as my friends in Aleppo and Latakia, are relieved that their worst nightmares aren't coming true yet. But there are, at the same time, I hear from other people that most people are fearful, and a lot of people are hiding. They're certainly not criticizing the new government. All of the Syrian government flags have been removed and replaced with Syrian rebel flags. And we've got situations like there's been a lot of media coverage of of Sanaya prison, and they released everybody in the prison. Well, significant percentage of those people were ISIS, were actual terrorists, and and other people were simply thieves or people who had killed people. So I don't know what good it does to do a blanket release of prisoners there. And I think it's also revealing that they can't rely on authentic events, but they have to stage them, such as the CNN reporter Clarissa Ward. And probably some of you have seen the video where she purports to going to Sydney prison and finding a prison cell that had not been opened up yet, and they broke the lock on the prison cell. They went in, they saw a blanket in the side, and lo and behold, there's somebody underneath it. And he claims to have been there for 3 months, and he hugs Clarissa, and Clarissa is very affectionate toward him, and it's all looking very, very phony because he supposedly hasn't eaten or had water for 4 days. Well, he's looking pretty darn healthy. His clothes are clean, and his hands are even manicured. So it's clear that this is another one of those staged events, and it's as phony as the white helmets. So I think what we're seeing is an exaggeration of support. There's a lot of people who are hopeful in Syria because they've been going through hell. They've had a hard time living, subsisting for over a decade now. And in the last 4 or 5 years, as the terrorists and the civilians in the terrorist-controlled region of Idlib have been nurtured by the West and trained and received humanitarian aid, the people in the rest of Syria have been crushed economically and have been impoverished. So a lot of people are hopeful, but the media is exaggerating the support for the government, and they're definitely hiding the fear and the atrocities. And once again, there's RT currently has a story which is a compilation of some of the atrocities that have been video recorded in the last week. So, what are the consequences of the events, the dramatic events in Syria? The resistance in Lebanon has been hugely weakened because Syria was a supporter of the resistance in Lebanon, and Syria was a key passageway for support from Iran, material support and weapons and other goods to come from Iran through Iraq and Syria to reach the Lebanese resistance. You've had the resistance in Palestine is going to be greatly weakened. We already see that the media is forgetting about Gaza. The atrocities, the genocide in Gaza is continuing. It hasn't stopped, and it may even escalate because all the attention is on Syria. And Benjamin Netanyahu is very happy, and he's crowing from Golan, and it's not good. It's not good for Palestine. The conflict between the Kurds and Turkey, I expect to continue, although I also expect that the U.S. will use its influence and will pressure Turkey to come to some kind of an agreement. I think the Kurds are going to be forced to trim their sails by the U.S. But it's a little bit unclear it is unclear what's going to happen there. You've got Israel emboldened. Talk about a consequence, an emboldened Israel. They went from the world condemning Israel, and most of the world is still condemning Israel, but the West, even the West, and Ireland has recently condemned Israel, and Israel's removed their embassy from Ireland apparently. But among the countries that matter most to Israel, such as the United States, Canada, and West Europe, and Australia, they are just continuing it. And I think we can expect to see that that philosophy of Benjamin Netanyahu that's spelled out in his book, Fighting Terrorism, equating Palestinian resistance, Lebanese resistance, Syrian independence, equating that with terrorism and in denying his own terrorism, that's going to embolden Israel and the greater Israel, the plans to keep expanding the Israeli border. The mentality that led to that you don't have to give an inch, you don't have to compromise, you can just keep up the aggression, that is going to be emboldened by the events of the last 2 weeks. As well, I think the neocons in Washington are going to be emboldened. Just in the last week, we've seen threats from Washington being directed at Venezuela, where they had an election last July, I think, and there's President Maduro is going to be taking the inauguration for his new term of office is going to take place January 10. Meanwhile, you've got an opposition person that says that he won the election, and the U.S. is backing that with no evidence whatsoever. In fact, it wasn't just the Venezuelan government; it was their Supreme Court and their election tribunal. And I've been an observer in election at 2 different elections, and their election is it has verification all over it. It's a very, very good election system that allows for verification, and the opposition in Venezuela is making their claims with no evidence at all. The evidence is innuendo and reports and propaganda in the New York Times and Washington Post. So this is just an indication that Washington neocons and Washington foreign policy, we will have to see whether it's going to change under Trump. Um, but the events in Syria are not good. They're not good for Lebanon, Palestinians. They're not good for anywhere in the world which has been suffering from the U.S. Intervention, U.S. aggression, U.S. claims to U.S. Supremacy and exceptionalism. So. Thank you very much, and I'll leave it there. I think how are we doing on time? So I
It's
guess I talked a little bit
11:25.
more than I said I was going to. Sorry about that, but we still got 30. We still got half an hour for questions, and so I'm looking forward to that discussion.
Thank you, Rick. Just a few brief announcements before we take questions from participants. If you have a question, you can raise your hand by clicking on the reactions button to raise your hand, the lower part of your Zoom window. We're short on time today, so we're going to be very strict about asking people to keep your questions short to within 2 minutes and one question per participant. Just a few quick announcements. Next week, we're going to have another important session. The US and Israel are pushing the world to the brink of World War III. And our speaker is Bahman Assad, who will be speaking on that topic and especially focused on Iran, which really ties into today's discussion. On Sunday, December 29th, we are not going to have a session because of the holiday break. And we'll be back on January 5th. If you want to receive notifications for future programs, you can sign up at icssmarks.org. Very top of the homepage, there's a form. Put your name and your email address in there, and you will receive email notifications for future sessions. We don't share sign up information with anybody, and you can always unsubscribe and then resubscribe. Okay, so we also want to remind people that you can go to our website, view past sessions. You can contact us with suggestions for sessions, comments, anything at all. There's a contact form on our website. And if you wish to make a donation to support our Sunday morning program, there's also information about how to do that. We do have costs associated with doing this. So with that, oh my gosh, we've got like quite a few people raising their hands here. And I'm going to start off by, and Mehmet, if you would please keep time on this. I'm going to start off with Lucy, if you would please unmute and ask your question.
Yes, thank you so much. It was a very thorough talk, and I'm very happy to have been present and listening to it. The question I had was, I had heard that that there may BRICS turn into a military alliance that could challenge the U.S. aggression in the different parts of the world. Do you think that's possible, or any indication of something like that happening?
Now you're speaking about the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia,
BRICS.
India.
Yeah.
I think it's unlikely. They are very tentative actually. They even say that they aren't out to topple the US dollar as the world's foreign currency. So I think it's unlikely that there would be a military alliance of that type formed. However, I think an alliance between other countries. Well, Russia already has something of an alliance with Iran, and of course they have extremely close relations with China. So I think that's more likely to see neighboring states.
Maybe
Yeah.
China. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, next is Yuri. If you would please unmute and ask your question, please keep it to under 2 minutes. Go ahead, Yuri. Yuri,
One
there,
moment.
there you go. Go
Yeah.
ahead.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you to the presenters. Thank you to the organizers for organizing this. And Rick, it's always great to hear to hear your thoughts on anything, but also talking especially about Syria. I think the two I think the one thing I wanted to ask you about is how much do you think uh outlets like Al Jazeera and yeah, how much do you think outlets like Al Jazeera, Middle East Eye, and Middle East Monitor played in sadly a lot of people we know who are great on Palestine solidarity, both Westerners and people of the Middle East diaspora, but we're just so bad on all things Syria. And I think the other thing I wanted to say, which I think is just a comment, is I think despite this huge victory of Western imperialism, I really do think that we should pay tribute to the fact that Syria resisted for as long as they could multiple aggressions from the West, Gulf, Israeli, and Turkey. And I think for that alone, I think they deserve, our tribute in resisting anti-imperialism, as well as our condolences, because despite all the ridiculous celebrations, Syria is going to experience a combination of what happened in both Libya and Afghanistan when the communists were overthrown by the Western-backed Mujahideen. So I'm just curious your response to both of those.
Yeah, regarding Al Jazeera, Middle East Eye, and other Qatari publications, I think it's very clear. Qatar is not only closely related to or closely in alliance with Turkey, and associated with the Muslim Brotherhood. It's a Sunni sectarian organization, but they also have the U.S. military with a huge naval base there. So that I think explains their poor position on Syria from the very start, where they refused to. One of their Al Jazeera reporters quit and resigned in 2011 when he wanted to report that there were jihadist fighters going into Syria, and they would not allow it because at the time they were claiming, oh, well, the Syrian opposition is just a local issue and they're just peaceful protesters. And so they prevented this reporter from documenting the foreign fighters with arms going into Syria. So, and then recently, Middle East Eye, Jonathan Cook is a very good analyst and reporter based in Nazareth, and he wrote a very good article on Syria that they initially were going to run. In fact, I think he was writing it for them initially, and they've retracted it. They've just removed it from their website. So that's Al Jazeera. And what was the other question, quickly, Yuri?
No, the other thing was just a comment that I just think, regardless of our comrades in the Middle Eastern diaspora and those white and those friends of ours who call themselves socialists, I think regardless of those guys celebrating this as a huge victory for revolutions and stuff like that, which it isn't, because Syria is going to become another Libya, Afghanistan. I just think that in light of that, we should pay tribute to the Syrian Arab Republic and the Syrian folks themselves who resisted multiple imperialist aggressors for as long as they could.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think next question.
Next question is Polina, followed by Roger. So go ahead, Polina.
Thank you, Rick, for a very helpful presentation. I agree with the comments we just heard from the previous speaker regarding the that we need to recognize how much Syria has stood up against imperialism. Military analyst Elijah Magnier has had an analysis that I'm curious your thoughts about. He basically points out that President Bashar al-Assad actually had a somewhat doubtful policy regarding his actions towards the Palestinian resistance. Magnier points out that Hezbollah had placed heavy military weaponry on the Syrian side of the basically in Syria, I think in the Golan, and when requested by Hezbollah to clearly enter the fight to open an extra front after October 7th, they said that Syria refused basically under the considerations that the government was weak. It was important to prevent the government from falling rather than opening the front. But I mean, I'm summarizing the argument perhaps incorrectly. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm wondering your thoughts about that consideration. Thank you.
Well, first of all, Elijah Magnier is an excellent analyst, and she's another one that people would do well to follow. But the details of that, I think I'm unclear. I know there's a theory that's going out saying that Assad was bent on restoring relations with the Gulf states and getting back in the Arab League, and they were requiring him to reduce his dependence on both Iran and Russia, and that he went along with that, and that was a huge mistake. There are reports that both Iran and Russia in recent years offered to retrain and to re-equip the Syrian Arab Army and to improve the training of some of the forces. There are also reports that Assad was requested by one of the Gulf states to replace some of the generals in the Syrian Arab Army with younger officers who were more amenable to their way of thinking and were. So I think it's possible he's right. I think another factor in the Israeli attacks, the constant Israeli attacks, and this is another thing that I didn't mention. Another factor is the demoralization, because over years, Syria has been attacking, or Israel has been attacking Syria, but in the last year, it has just been every week there were attacks on Syrian forces and the killing of not just Iranians but Syrians. And when that just goes on and it's repeated without retaliation, it's demoralizing. It's demoralizing to the population. So I think in hindsight, they should have retaliated. They should have done something, and it would have not only been a sign of their solidarity with Gaza. After all, the Houthis from Yemen are doing their very costly but important examples of solidarity by preventing ships from going to Israel directly up the Red Sea. And Hezbollah was doing attacks into northern Israel and demanding that there be a ceasefire. So in retrospect, I think it was a big mistake. So I think there's probably something. The details I don't know. There's different theories out. I don't know the details on that, but I think there's definitely something to it. And Magnier is another analyst who's very good. Kevork Almasian is another one that people want to, if they're not aware of him. He's based in Germany now, but he's from Aleppo. He grew up in Aleppo and left there as in the conflict, during the conflict.
Okay, next up is Roger, followed by Janet. So Roger, please unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. Very good presentation. I especially appreciated the analogies that you made toward Venezuela, because I think, as you pointed out, the same playbook, the same imperialist playbook that was played out in Syria is being played out in a number of places, particularly in Venezuela. Venezuela is one of the leading supporters of the Palestinian causes internationally. And we see the same type of demonization of the leadership, the same type of hybrid war, and also as you pointed out, the sort of corrosive effect of long-term sanctions, which demoralize the population and help to undermine the basis, or also the whole notion of with sanctions comes corruption, because you have to use back channels to get around sanctions. Another thing I think that is a Syria-Venezuela connection is oil pipelines, because now an oil pipeline is green lighted through Syria, which will allow the Gulf states to avoid hostile countries bring oil to Europe, which will further undermine Russia and Venezuela in their ability to resist U.S. imperialism. With that said, I do have a question. And the question is really, for us, we're not going to influence U.S. Policy, which we could, but we can help challenge the narrative. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about what you thought about challenging the narrative, particularly the one that we were hearing from the would-be leftists, the people I call the anti-imperialists, who, they were all in favor of getting rid of Gaddafi. Now that Gaddafi's gone, they don't take any responsibility for what followed. They want victory in Ukraine and that type of thing. And now I'm hearing, I kind of live in a bubble, I have to admit, a sort of a liberal bubble, but everybody's very happy now about the dictator being liberated. The people of Syria being liberated from the dictator, and that this has been a really wonderful thing where, at least at this time, the U.S. and Israel were on the right side. This talk, of course, and
2 minutes
Yuri's,
limit.
okay, I'll stop there.
Okay, so the question was,
How to change the narrative.
yeah, challenging the narrative. I think it just continues. We're kind of a mouse, going up against an elephant. And so some of us have been doing this for, a long time, whether it was exposing the white helmets or some of the other, the chemical weapons claims and so forth, the demonization of Assad. It's nonstop. I think it's important to keep challenging it and to as much as possible to rely on facts. Fortunately, we had a lot of facts emerge over those, but how much of a dent, because the mass media doesn't give it any coverage. I guess, thinking back on it now, I'm thinking that we really need to transition more. Those of us who are, have been around for a while, we need to transition more and use more of the media which young people are looking at. So that would call for doing more short videos or short statements on TikTok or X or Rumble is very good. Spreading the word, I think, is continues to be very important. And Venezuela, of course, is going to be huge. There's one other aspect that I wanted to mention that I didn't mention that came up earlier, and that's a similarity between Syria and Ukraine. Because in both cases, you had a frozen conflict. Of course, in Ukraine, you had the coup in 2014, and then you had kind of then you had the breakaway of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, and the situation was kind of supposedly frozen, and they had the agreement there. But what happened during the agreement was that the coup forces and the neo-Nazis in Ukraine were being armed and trained and boosted by NATO, And you had the same thing going on in Idlib. So you had what was supposedly a truce or a ceasefire or a frozen conflict, and you had one side ramping up, rapidly ramping up their forces. And then what we've seen is the result in Syria is you had the overrunning. And I think they wanted to do that in Ukraine as well. They wanted to overrun Lugansk and Donetsk. And of course, the SMO stopped that. But that's a similarity and regarding the so-called frozen, that's the risk of a frozen conflict, which isn't sufficiently monitored.
Okay, next is Janet, followed by Raj, and then James McFadden. So Janet, please go ahead.
All right. Thank you, Rick, for your presentation. I have some additional information sprinkled with a question or two that I'd appreciate your commenting on. In a video on Thursday, Richard Medhurst, Syrian, British, went into discuss Turkey, Israel, and the US carving up Syria's natural resources like vultures after removing al-Assad. He talked about a gas pipeline project that Turkey and Qatar wanted to go through Syria that Assad turned down in 2009. Israel will steal Syria's and Lebanon's gas and will now be able to extract the Leviathan gas field in the Mediterranean. The Beirut port has been out of action after the 2020 explosion. Latakia port now is out of action. And the US is continuing to steal Syria's oil and block access to Syria by China's Belt and Road Project. He or someone else said this assault was planned to happen in 2025, but they took advantage of the current situation. Croatian market analyst and researcher Alice Krainer says in an interview that victory over Syria was too easy, and he suspects it was a secret trap set by Russia to bring these various elements into a quagmire. I'm wondering if you would comment on Colonel Jacques Baud's explainer on Syria, on how Syria became so vulnerable since 2011. He gave that interview on December 9th. I'll paste links to those interviews in the chat. And finally, more on your Syria-Ukraine similarity. It seems to me that the takeover last week of Syria by HTS, which is backed by the US CIA, co-opting the so-called Syrian revolution, is very similar to the takeover of Ukraine in 2014 during the
2 minutes.
Can I just finish my sentence?
Sure.
As co-opted by the Azov Brigade, which was engineered and funded by the US and CIA. Yanukovych fled to Russia, Assad fled to Russia, and the subversion of the Astana agreement between Syria, Iran, and Turkey seems similar to what happened with the Minsk II agreement.
Well, briefly, good points there, Janet. Regarding the oil pipeline, I think that's very credible. In fact, there was the statement from the Turks that they're already moving toward that is really confirmation. Some people have said that the conflict was all about that, and I don't buy that. I think it was a factor, I think Qatar and Turkey are relishing this, and this will be a factor. There's one other factor regarding geography, which is important, which I haven't seen commented on very often, which is that this puts Iran in a more dangerous position because previously Israeli jets that wanted to fly to Iran to attack Iran, they're now going to have a much easier flight path going over Syria. And Syria's in no position to stop them because all of their anti-aircraft weaponry has been destroyed. So this is going to be much more dangerous for Iran, and I'm sure they're aware of it and they're ramping up their defenses accordingly. Jacques Baud, I did see on Twitter some of his summaries, which seem to be pretty accurate. So I'll just recommend that people do look at Jacques Baud, B-A-U-D.
Okay, next is Raj, followed by James, followed by Anne. And again, everybody, please be patient. We're going to try to get as many people in as we can. So Raj, go ahead. Let's keep everything short.
Sure. Rick, thank you very much for a very detailed description of what happened there and tracing the history and so forth. Thank you. I have trouble believing that an army of 250,000 cannot face up to 40,000, even no matter how well trained. Armies fight. I mean, I think somewhere at the command level of the army, up in the state, there is a demoralization, which is what led to this. And this is definitely a loss for Iran. First of all, Syrian people, Iran and Russia, this is not anything tactical on part of Russia. Russia couldn't, its own resources couldn't support here. But major point here is, it seems to me, it's a failure at the state level. The organization of power which Assad led, it seems to have buckled and not, they didn't certainly, Syrian people had fought hard, Syrian army fought very hard. I think there's something here that doesn't add up for me. Could you address that? Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Raj. I think you're right. There was betrayal at high levels in the military. It was a little bit similar to the situation in Mosul, Iraq, which ISIS conquered in a day, and suddenly the troops had gone. They evaporated, and I think there were people. I think there was bribery happening at the top level, and I think they worked on this for a long time. It just didn't happen overnight. I think they had been working to find the Syrian military officers who they could pay off and make promises to. And then there was the general demoralization that was a factor. And I think there was the Assad government tried to do a crackdown on corruption some years ago, and it looked like they were going to go. He did charges against one of his cousins, and it looked like there was going to be a major campaign against corruption, but that fizzled, and corruption, went on as before, and maybe it even got worse. I remember about 5 or 6 years ago, I was in Damascus and we stopped. I was with my friend there who was a translator. And we stopped a couple of young men on the street and we asked them, what do they think? What are the most important things now? And they said, both of them, and these were Palestinian Syrians. They're Palestinians, but they're descendants of refugees. And so they have all the privileges of being Syrian citizen, but they don't have they retain their Palestinian citizenship. Anyway, these young men, we said what needs to be done. They said two things: one, defeat the extremists, and two, defeat corruption. And I think that was the case. And they did defeat the extremists, largely, but we see not totally, obviously. And they didn't defeat corruption at all.
Okay, next is James, followed by Anne. So James, please go ahead.
Hi, Rick. Since my file on Syria goes back about 11 years, I think you probably pointed me to that back then. I think it's important to understand that to look at what's happened in Ukraine and see that the whole nature of the way war is fought is different. And it seems like the HTS was equipped with modern drones and stuff. That makes a huge difference.
Mhm.
It's not so much about how many on each side. It's really about this new technology that comes into play that really can devastate one side if the other doesn't have countermeasures. What I've been looking around for good people to listen to, like Mohammed Randi and Aaron Mate and Pepe Escobar and stuff for some analysis, which gives sort of what's going on now or speculation. But I'm actually been looking for more written analysis and of the geopolitics and stuff, and trying to find places to go look for that. And I wonder if you could suggest something along that. And in particular, I came across one just recently called OMRAND, which seems to be some think tank sponsored by Turkey, probably in the US, that's been studying, it's been around since 2013, that's, analysis of Syria. And if you could comment on that, and if you know, like, where they get their funding. Uh, it's interesting because they have articles that are quite critical of HTS. So, but you got to take it maybe with a grain of salt. Thanks.
Yeah. Hi, Jim. I'm not sure. Was it the Omen? Is that the title?
OMRAN it's a think tank. You can find.
Yeah, I'm not very familiar with that one. In terms of other sources, a couple of good ones are thecradle.co, the Cradle of Civilization, thecradle.co. It's not com, it's co. It's very good. El
Yeah,
Mayadeen.
Pepe does that, writes there, I think.
Yeah, El Mayadeen, Sharmi Narwani, and a very good team is that's one of the best ones. And El Mayadeen out of Beirut is very good.
Okay, next is Anne, followed by Goulden. So Anne, please go ahead. Unmute.
Mute. Okay, well, just a sec. Oh, I had to unmute and everything. Okay, I have two questions. Do you have any thoughts about how Somaliland plays into this? And second, what do you have to say about Hamas's statement that they support THS?
On the first question, Somaliland, I don't know. I do know that Somalia was on the initial hit list that Wesley Clark talked about. And if you go through the list of articles, Sudan, Somalia, Libya, Iran, Lebanon, and Iraq, they're working their way through the list. Sudan's been put into turmoil with the secession of South Sudan. The Darfur campaign was always very much promoted by Israel, and so they've really done a job at promoting undermining other countries. And regarding Hamas has always been split. Actually, in 2013, there were elements of Hamas. There was one faction in Hamas that very much supported the Syrian government, but there was another faction of Hamas, largely funded by Qatar and associated with the Muslim Brotherhood, which of course is the origin of Hamas, that opposed Assad and saw at the time you had the Muslim Brotherhood in leadership in Egypt, and they were very hopeful, and they cast their lot with the opposition in Syria. So there's always been a division. Yahya Sinwar, just 4 or 5 months before he was murdered, he issued a statement of support for the Syrian government and acknowledging the amount of support they've had from them as well as Hezbollah. So it's split. I assume that they're doing that just hoping against hope that the insurgents now in power in Syria will over time evolve and will support the Palestinian cause. That's certainly the case with Hamas itself. It began as a strictly religious movement that was supported by Tel Aviv because it was in contrast and to some extent in conflict with the PFLP and Fatah and others. So they were initially supported, and Hamas, over the years, of course, emerged as the primary fighting force and resistance force. So I think they are just hoping. I assume it's a bit of opportunism and coupled with a bit of ideological, Hamas is mostly Sunni. And so I think it's, hope more than anything.
Okay,
I was
next.
just a note. I was talking about Somaliland, not Somalia, but go ahead.
Okay. Next is Golden, followed by Citizen One, and we're going to wrap it up after those two, but we're going to continue if people want to discuss afterwards. So Golden, please go ahead.
Thank you, Rick, for the presentation. I enjoyed it so much. I'm from Turkey, and I'm finding Turkey's position in Syria is most harming, along with the US and Israel. Turkey invaded north of Syria in around 2011, I believe, claiming that Kurdish YPG terrorist forces are hiding there. Turkey has been occupying there in north of Syria since then, against Assad's objections and Turkey is backing up the opposition forces, HTS, against Assad, even though Turkish officials are refusing it. But analysts say that HTS is gaining this much power would not be possible without Turkish backing. So there are millions of Syrians already living in Turkey, and they welcome this toppling down Assad and changing government to HTS, hoping that they can go back to their country. Do you think this instability in the region, in Syria specifically, could bring even more refugees to Turkey, which is already causing an increase of racism and nationalism in Turkey against Syrian refugees? And the other question is, the other risk for Turkey is that there's going to be a jihadist government right next to the borders. Turkish government is already an Islamist government fighting to destroy the secular structures in the country every day. Do you think this could, so-called secularism can endure in Turkey, surrounded by these Islamic influences?
I think you're exactly right. It could all blow up in Erdogan's face, and especially and that's another reason why there was careful preparation of the jihadists before they went into Aleppo. But it's hard to change a leopard's spots, and I think over time it's definitely possible that the extremist core will return to HTS, and that there are a lot of people, instead of Syrians coming back, which may happen to some extent in the near future, it's possible that a lot of people will want to leave Syria, as happened. They flooded away, during the heart of the conflict. In fact, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of Syrians who were trying to get into Lebanon just several days ago. Syrians who felt under threat. And on that note, I think it's really tragic that Erdogan was able to, almost steal the 2015 vote in Turkey, because there was a real chance that you could have a change of government and you could have him out of power and not assuming the presidency as he did and not assuming the control. And the Turkish Kurdish forces allied with other progressive forces in Turkey, and that could have made a real difference, a real positive difference to the conflict in Syria, because it would have they wouldn't have provided an avenue and support for ISIS and other jihadists. So it's tragic how things could happen, and I think things could get a lot worse before they get better.
Okay, we just have a few more minutes here, running over a bit. Citizen One, go ahead. And Rick, I don't know how much longer you can stick around. We have two more questioners after that, but you have to take off.
Yeah, I actually do. I've got another commitment. So
Okay,
yeah.
let's do citizen one, and then we'll stay on and continue the discussion. So please go ahead.
Okay, I'm just going to say for the benefit of the subsequent listening audience who won't have access to the chat, that Rick Sterling also has interviews on various political topics at YouTube. And there's actually a collection of interviews and more with Rick Sterling on YouTube, as well as an intriguingly titled interview, Rick Sterling, JFK and RFK's Battle Against Zionist Extremism. And also for the subsequent listening audience who won't have access to the chat, Richard Medhurst, whom I mentioned before the recording started, is a progressive Christian, Syrian-born and raised British independent journalist who has a regular YouTube podcast that you can subscribe to. And Medhurst was demonetized on YouTube and is always threatened with cancellation, and was recently arrested while flying into Heathrow under the Labour government's so-called anti-terrorism laws. And lastly, I just want to say that for everyone here, a regular audience attender here, Steve Martino, Martinot, has a brand new book called Police Brutality, A Study of Police Culture in the US. So I ordered it at my favorite neighborhood bookstore, but you can find a description of it at Amazon. And again, the title is Police Brutality, A Study of Police Culture in the US by Steve Martino, Martinot. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's, Rick, do you have a final comment you want to make?
Well, just to mention, if anybody wants to, I do have to go now. But if anybody wants to send me an email with a question, that I would welcome that. My email address is not hard to find, but it's rsterling1@gmail.com. And it was a pleasure to be here. And let's keep on fighting because, well, what's the alternative?
Thank you, Rick. Great session. Just want to remind people to come back next week. We're going to have Bahman Azad talking about Iran, almost really a continuation of today's discussion. And you can sign up at icssmarks.org to receive notifications of future programs. And with that, we're going to stop the recording. And
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses. Since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums, please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, @yahoo.com, and the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.